people in theology, let's say it this way, too many people in theism and atheism are abusing theology in that when you listen to theists, they will put together things like this. Um, let's come up with something real quick that is very, very commonplace in theism. If the doctrine of the cross is true, and it is, and if human intellect rejects it, and it does, what does that say about our intellect? And so on the other side of the coin, we hear people just saying sky daddy, and leprechauns, and it becomes a very inarticulate approach toward theology itself, simply because theology is the study of, that is theos, that is a term that we're wrestling with, trying to figure out whether there is a God or not, and if there is a God, what does that mean? And so theologians are not really saying that God exists, but rather, if there is a God, perhaps he created existence, whatever creation might be. That would be another show. But so many people are abusing theology simply trying to make a point. I hear atheists all the time trying to make a case for justification for atheism, in that they will pull an Old Testament passage out of an abjad, and without even understanding what the abjad means, they're going to push back on it and suggest that that's justification for their atheism. That's quite ignorant, to say the least. And on the other side of the coin, theists are doing the same thing, spinning things to get people saved and yah. And so I want to bring Bob in, and tonight we do not have any video outside of in-house cameras, but we are going to do the best that we can, even though we had this little device. It's a little, I'm not going to call it what it is, but it just went out, and so sometimes things get poo-pooed, okay? But with that said, how are you doing, Bob?
I'm doing fine. And, I think that I can put this very simply as to what's really going on. It's not that people are just naturally stupid, although sometimes I think we come across as if we are. I think that part of what human beings do is that the longer you hold on to a conclusion, the more obvious you think that it is. And the more obvious you think that it is, the more you tend to hang out with just people who agree with you. And the more you hang out with people who agree with you, the more you don't even realize that what you're saying begs the question. And as a result, if you've been hanging out with believers for a long time, and you really believe that the Bible is the Word of God, you lose sight of the fact that you can't prove that, and you think that the only problem here is people have to prove that it isn't the Word of God or something. And the same thing's true on the other side, that you've become disenchanted with the claims. You don't resonate with this idea.
Right.
You see people saying a lot of things that just don't make sense to you. It seems obvious to you there is no God. These ideas are silly. Blah blah blah. After a while, you get to the point where you think that this is just the default position, and does not require that it even make sense. It just is obviously true, and as a result, we can get to the point where, as human beings, no matter what side of the question we're on, we seem to think that it's just obviously true, and that the only problem here are the people who aren't going along with us.
Speaking about the default position, I've had atheists on who are presidents of associations that would suggest that the null hypothesis needs to be used here, and in that atheism is the default position. What say you? I mean, I laugh when I hear that, because how can you have even suggest the null hypothesis when you have nothing available?
Now, in science and in mathematics, because these are about things that can be discovered, it makes sense to have a particular default position. But we haven't even demonstrated that the question of God comes under the purview of these things.
Right.
And these default positions, for example, the default position of skepticism in science is not the default position because skepticism is so right. It isn't. The reason why skepticism works so well in science is because human beings do possess a great deal of bias, and skepticism serves the purpose of bringing some measured balance to that bias. And as a result, if you want to pursue things with your biases having as minimal an impact as possible, the skepticism as a discipline really helps.
Right.
But the reason why the skepticism helps is because there are actually ways of measuring, empirically coming up with certain facts, various other things that are actually available to us that can help to then squelch that skepticism and lay it to rest. But when it comes to the question of God, we've got nothing on any side. And so therefore, any default position is just stacking the cards before you even begin.
Diana, come into the chat here. What are your thoughts on what we're talking about here?
Hi, yeah, and I was just having something coming into my mind when Bob was just talking here. I mean, for those who may be a little new to the topic, the discipline, if you will, if we don't have anything to measure, say, does God exist or is God real? What would be the use of pursuing the question, or alternately, how would one go about pursuing the question?
Yeah, we can't even. The atheist has, or the agnostic has something I think really to say here. Sometimes people think that, well, agnosticism means that your default position is atheism, but really it is a recognition of we've got a linguistic and conceptual problem here, just trying to even address the question to begin with, that makes it very difficult to proceed. I mean, even in science, a scientific theory is not acceptable unless it's trying to explain something that seems to require explanation. And so therefore there has to be something that really asks the question with some in an indismissible way.
Yeah, and this is how I can see where it would be rather easy for the layperson, if you will, to go with a narrative such as your basic Southern Baptist preacher might offer, or Aaron Ra might offer, something that sounds definite, something that sounds reachable. Now, how does one get the average person to think in different terms?
You're really asking a person you're inviting a person to possess a bias they don't have. How do you do that? Well, there actually is a way of doing that, but it's not a logical way. The way you do that is you create emotional reasons, which, when it comes to demonstrating proof, are totally insufficient. But we like to think of ourselves as intelligent people, and we don't want to admit to ourselves that a great deal of our default positions are based upon what we feel intuitively, and all that rationale that we add to it is really an afterthought. A lot of it is very logical and reasonable, but it is amazing how, I mean, sometimes you'll see this, like this even happens in religion, happens in politics. Like I knew a Methodist minister who was somebody who didn't, in Methodism, many Methodists will believe the idea that if you fall into sin, you lose your salvation, and then some Methodist minister who's been teaching this all of his life might get to the point where he's running out of room in the Methodist church, and he's not relating well there, and maybe he gets fired and he has to leave, and he thinks about going over to the Baptist church. Well, over here at the Baptist church, we believe once saved, always saved. Well, it's amazing how these people can just make the switch,
Yeah.
and and they do that. Or Ronald Reagan went from being a Democrat to being a Republican, and people do this kind of thing, and when they switch paradigms, uh, it's amazing how everything changes. And uh, we're kidding ourselves, I think, if we're not going to admit that the fundamental level of our basic ideas are emotionally intuitive and not rational. Rationality is what we add to the issue after the fact of an intuitive bias. Not to say that intuition can't change, it does. But the way intuition changes even a lot of people don't think of this. Coherence is an emotion. Yes, we can achieve coherence and we can precipitate and stimulate it through the presentation of facts that we cannot deny and things like that. But the experience that something is coherent is an emotion, and it requires that emotion for that bias to change. And so I think that what it comes down to is something we as human beings don't want to admit, that our, as rational as we can be, fundamentally, our perspective of our worldview is an emotional one.
Yeah, and that feeds into one of the streams, one of the non-NCG stream I was on this morning. We were talking about homophobia and religion. The way a lot of people will use their religion to reinforce their pre-existing biases, for example, kind of works against the kind of thing we're trying to look at here, doesn't it?
Yeah, I would even go so far as to say that I think a lot of people who condemn homosexuality aren't even homophobic. They're just trying to be consistent with the paradigm they think they're supposed to be loyal to. They don't even know what they're talking about,
That came up, yeah.
They become more ego oriented and emotionally attached to defending the position that they're at. But and this is not to say that there aren't homophobic people. There certainly are. But also, I think a lot of homophobia sometimes things are accused of being homophobia that are not. For example, the vast majority of people find sexual behaviors they're not personally interested in to be a little bit on the yucky side. I mean, talk to a 7-year-old about kissing somebody, and yuck, you know. And so there's something about the particular attraction we experience that strikes us as being the desirable one, and the attractions we don't have are kind of like, yeah, I wouldn't want to do that, yuck, but it is, that doesn't mean there's a fear of it. It just means that that our tastes, when they develop in a particular direction, develop both positively and negatively in ways I don't think we entirely understand, particularly when it comes to sexuality. And so I don't think we should assume that this is necessarily that kind of thing, although if we misunderstand those feelings, it can become extremely abusive. And I mean, the whole idea of saying, well, homosexuality is unnatural. Well, you know what? That which is not within your taste and that which is truly unnatural will feel the exact same way to you. It will,
Right.
And
But
and so, the argument that it's unnatural is just is a conflation of those two experiences.
let's get Daryl into the conversation. Hello, Daryl.
Hello, good evening.
Did you have a good Mother's Day morning?
Well, I did. It was quite interesting. We were in Austin with our oldest son and his family, and it was good. It was very enjoyable. We spent most of our day, quite honestly, driving, getting back here, but had a lot of contacts, a lot of love expressed toward my wife. And we never get tired of that, of course.
Right,
But
right.
yeah, it's been a good day.
That sounds good. You've heard the syllogism over and over again. If the doctrine of the cross is true, and it is, and if human intellect rejects it, and it does, what does that suggest about our intellect? What are your thoughts on that now?
Well, there should be some cohesion, I think, between the two. Between intellect and what we reject. I mean, I think at some point, if something is intellectually sound, it should make sense to us. And so, I guess I'm more inclined to consider that these days. As a matter of fact, that's the way I try to approach most conversation, not as if, I know something entirely intellectually, or that I totally reject it because it doesn't seem sound to me. But I'm willing to kind of put it in a balance and put it on the shelf if need be, And it goes back to, and I don't know of any other better way to say it. People maybe get tired of hearing it, but being committed to a process rather than a conclusion. In the past, I've personally reached certain conclusions, not necessarily based on intellectual or rationality, but as a matter of fact, I guess what you just said would be about the only way to explain it. What I might answer that question, what does that say about the human intellect, is that it's not as easily satisfied, or shouldn't be as easily satisfied as we try to make it at times. In other words, if your intellect rejects something, there may be a good reason for that. Now, the way I would approach that particular statement would have been more along the lines of, there's something wrong with our intellect and we need to bypass it. And I think that was the response that, let's just say that in a religious setting or in a church setting, that statement was laid out there. That would be the response that you would hope to get is, well, there's something wrong with human intellect if it rejects that.
Yeah, this is like, I mean, what does the build up to the question have to do with the question?
Well, here's the thing, Bob.
If they're unrelated,
Right.
Okay, they first of all they say something that is an unproven thing, and
Right.
then try to find out, your rejection of it. What does this say about your intellect?
Okay,
my
but-
intellect hasn't always been strong. In fact, I think of the last Mother's Day gift I ever gave my mom was before she passed, was I gave her a mug that said, "Happy Mother's Day from the world's worst son." The only problem was I gave her the mug on Father's Day.
Okay, let's back up on the syllogism for a moment and talk
I'd
about that.
My intellect was.
Okay, let's back up a bit and talk about this syllogism just for a moment. If the doctrine of the cross is true, and it is, why were we so gung-ho to buy into that? In other words, I think that people sitting in pews typically want to hear, music, they want to hear poetry, they want to hear a syllogism that would really reinforce their confirmation bias.
Yeah.
And so it's like, if the doctrine of the cross is true, and it is, and if human intellect rejects it, and it does, then what does that say about our intellect? And everyone goes, ha, 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 we're not smart, but God is. Oh, praise be to God. I think that's what is happening in churches, and that's one of the reasons that I walked away from church. But I can't say that that's not actually happening within the atheistic camps and revivals. The same kind of bullshit.
Right around. Sure.
I beg your pardon?
If you can turn that statement right around, you can say, if there is no God, and there is not, and if there are people out there who think they have an intellect and yet they believe in God, well, what does that say about the intellect?
Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
It's
you.
the same. It's
the same bullshit.
question.
Right.
Yeah, I've heard that more than once.
Yeah.
Oh, you've been to that
are we gonna
revival, is
deny
that
the
correct?
Uh-oh.
Yeah.
there are intelligent people out there of differing opinions about a wide variety of different things. Evidently, conclusions and opinions are not as connected strongly to our intellect as we would like to think they are.
People love syllogistic rambling for some
We have a
reason.
syllogism that is of a proper form for a syllogism, but that doesn't mean that the premises are valid. You know?
Yeah, most of them sound like what is it? Love is blind. Ray Charles is blind. Therefore, no, God is love. Love is blind. Ray Charles is blind. Therefore, Ray Charles is God.
Yeah.
I mean, most of the rhetoric going on in the great debate is mostly like that, which is pitiful.
An intellect rejects it, huh?
But that's marvelous, wonderful. Let's look at a passage and let's talk about the Bible for a moment. And this is the thing that I really have problems with. When people go to the text, they are working with the assumption, number one, they are assuming that these extant translation models are right. If I read 1 Corinthians chapter 1, verse 17, for the Christ did not send me to baptize, but to preach the gospel. Now that's a very difficult passage for the Church of Christ to deal with, because the premise of salvation for them in Pauline theology is that baptism must take place. And so here Paul is confessing, Christ did not send me to baptize. So that's, that throws a monkey wrench in their theology. But to preach the gospel, not with words of human wisdom, lest the cross of Christ be emptied of its power. Now, in Greek, this takes on a completely different meaning than what I've read in the NIV. But if I continue to read in the NIV, for the message of the cross is foolishness. Now, listen to how this was rendered by the King James Bible translators. It says, for the preaching of the cross is to them that perish foolishness. And so it's talking about the activity, the preaching. Whereas the NIV translators are talking about the message. And there's a difference between the activity of preaching and the content that is preached. And so you have two theological streams here, one being message, one being, the activity of preaching. And this is why you have so many people who are standing on the street corner, and most of these people really are King James only advocates, because they think that there is somehow this magical power, if I can put it that way, in the preaching of the cross. And this is one of the proof texts that really drives them. But if I can go back to the NIV, for the message of the cross is foolishness to those who are perishing. In other words, in theology, what we do see people who have bought in or bought the farm, that is, into these extant models of translation theory, which are terribly put together. They think, well, okay, anyone, the word foolishness, in Greek it simply means the product of a feeble mind. In other words, the one who is perishing, the one who is not a believer, he thinks that the cross is, the product of a feeble mind. And so lots and lots of theists in this context are making fun of those people who do not believe, quote unquote, the doctrine of the cross. But the opposite is true with Paul, for if you'll keep your finger there, in chapter 2, he said, verse 8, none of the rulers of this age understood it, for if they had, they would have never crucified the Lord of glory. And so was he advocating in chapter 1 the message or the content or even the preaching of the cross, if in fact, if they had known the wisdom of God, they would have never carried out the crucifixion itself? Does that make any sense, Bob?
Well, I think that we're dancing around an idea here that perhaps could be expressed in even a different way. And that is, Einstein even said, you can't solve the problems you have by using the same thinking you used to create those problems. You know? And uh, that's the same thing as saying, I think, that, to those that are perishing, the message of the cross is foolishness in this way. Uh, if you've ever known somebody who's got an issue or a problem that they just don't ever seem to be able to fix or resolve, chances are it's because there's something about reality that they believe that isn't true, so that when you tell them the kind of thing they really that could really help them solve their problem, they listen to that and they go, no, that can't be it. That can't be it. This difficulty we have in thinking outside of the box we're in is a part of why things that are outside of the box we're in always sound like foolishness to us, because they do violate the axiomatic the axiomatic assumptions we're living under. And I really think that I think that's more what Paul is getting at when he talks about, the message of the cross is foolishness to those that are perishing. But you asked earlier, well, why is it we buy into it? I think that we as human beings know that, well, we're making mistakes. We're also sometimes doing things we sense we really shouldn't have done. We can morally blame ourselves. We wonder what consequences that might have. We wonder if there's a God. And there's a sense in which this message of the cross, as it's often given to us, can fit into that idea in such a way as we resonate with, and also in such a way as somebody who's open to that idea could begin to worry about the risks they take if they reject it. So there's lots of reasons why a person might resonate or jump into that message, or think that they need to adopt it. But I think that also it's not that these people are fools. It's that all ideas that are outside of your box sound absurd to you. They do. It's that's just part of human nature, no matter what box you're in.
Now,
Well, for some reason, if you're wrapped up in that message, and to the point to where you're convinced, and going back to the statement, if the message of the cross is true, and it is, if you're in that box, it can be really scary to try to get out of that box, or to even think of the possibilities of getting out of it. Not just because of the fear, quote unquote, of God, but your family, all your friends. You've invested yourself, your whole life, into the ideology of it. And if all of a sudden you say, well, I'm not so sure about this, and you get outside the box, you climb outside of all the relationships that you've built, the way the relationships have been built. And you find yourself not only alone, but quite possibly, more or less, what would you call it, an outsider in your own family and among your own friends. So it's a big step. It's a huge step, even if you're struggling with thinking maybe this isn't right, and maybe I should consider other possibilities. So there's a lot, I think, involved here that is kind of unstated, so to speak.
okay, let me see if I can make a point. If I say halagos gar ha tu staru, we're talking about the message of the cross. Let's talk about logos for a moment, as opposed to rhema. So many people in church life, they enjoy the rhema. In fact, you have Rhema Bible Institute, and people make a lot of noise about that. In classical Greek and also in Koine Greek, for the most part, the most popular usages would be along these lines. Logos was typically a huge collection of words, in that Phrema was simply a small collection. And so Phrema can refer to the thing said as opposed to Logos, the thing that's been collected over a long period of time. And so when we analyze it that way, the outcome of translation would have a different outcome than what we see in these current extant translation models. However, if we just say, okay, here's a message, I don't think that this is just about a message. I think that Paul is saying something quite different, because if we look at what's being used here, he's using one of the things that I really like. He's using this participle, and this participle is, we can actually parse it or understand it morphologically as a middle and or passive participle. It's apolumenois, and apolumenois doesn't necessarily mean that something is perishing. It could mean that something is being loosed from, if you get what I'm saying. And so we could go in two different directions here. We could say that something is, or someone is perishing, or someone is being loosed.
Unfeathered.
Right. And so the following word, moria, typically is understood in Koine as the product of a feeble mind, whereas we could take that, for those people who perceive whatever this logos is, this may be a blessing. In other words, Paul could be articulating a message that's suggesting that the ones who think that this is the product of a feeble mind, those are the ones in the better position. Whereas the ones who align themselves along with Paul, because sometimes Paul, he plays the devil's advocate. In other words, he said, for those of you who have been like me, and there is a way to actually translate this to present Paul in a case that speaks about his past. And so if we look at it through the eyes of a different hermeneutic and with better lexical theory, the outcome would be you're better off thinking that this message, namely of this tu staru, is certainly a product of a feeble mind. Because it makes sense, because when he says, they would have never done any of this had they known the wisdom of God. That's a pushback on the very event itself. Does it make any sense?
Yeah.
And so it doesn't make a lot of sense for Paul to be advocating, let's market the message of the cross. Doggone, this is wonderful. Amen, hallelujah. Reach out and touch this television right now and receive your blessing. If he's doing that, why is he poo-pooing the entire narrative of the cross by the time that we get to chapter 2? And as he continues through this book, he continues to poo-poo the idea of, this cross idea. And so he does it in various ways. And so I think that a lot of people are abusing theology simply because they are not literate, possibly, in the languages, nor are they literate in theology.
Developmental problems.
Right.
For example, when I finally come to understand something, when I finally understand it, I format an entirely new way of talking about it once I understand it. But the way that I talk about it has very little to do with how it is I came to finally see it this way. And what most people do is when they learn something, and by the way, this as a teacher, as a college professor in sound engineering, I can't teach sound engineering by teaching people sound engineering, if you know what I'm saying.
Right.
I learned sound engineering by experiencing for myself what the problems are, what the obstacles are to coming to an understanding, and then finally arriving at those aha moments where I understand what's going on. So for me to teach sound engineering, I can't just teach them the conclusions I've finally arrived at. I have to find, where are they? What obstacles lie between them and a good understanding? And I have to take them through an experience that allows them to see these obstacles for what they are, have them fall away. And then once they get to see what sound engineering is, now we can start talking about it in its proper nomenclature. But you can't, and so we forget that the way we actually came to the opinions we have was not by the clear statement of those opinions as we're now able to make, which is, by the way, something I mentioned this to, I mean, way back when we even had like people like Dr. Shook on and things like this, when I said, you know, I find it interesting that when we're looking at these God debates, and when we're looking at whether we're talking about William Lane Craig
Right.
or these other people, that it's interesting that the arguments that they're bringing forth, that they have worked hard at trying to develop and that they think are so pithy and so powerful, are arguments that they've actually learned to make long after they accepted the idea that they're in. And as a result, that means that the best argument for God that a theist can come up with has absolutely nothing to do with why they became a theist.
Right.
And the other way around, are the process by which we arrive at something that we resonate with has very little to do, or not as much to do with the way we would talk about it once we're there. And we forget that. And as a result, I think that we are too quick to accuse other people of being feeble-minded, simply because we didn't arrive here directly, and when they don't arrive here directly, we think that must be because they're feeble-minded. No, it's because you don't understand the process by which a person is going to come to the point of being able to accept that as being rational or reasonable. You haven't taken them on the proper tour.
And we
Back-
could take process over conclusion to fit with that also.
Right.
One does not learn simply by, as you say, simply by being handed facts. One learns by finding out how to get to those facts. And getting to when someone learns a fact, that's all they know. If you say, okay, do this in order to get the soundboard working right and everything else, that particular soundboard configuration is the only one they know. That's all they know how to do. New soundboard comes by, they don't know what the hell to do with it. And the same way here in the writings, the scriptures, you get one fact, and I'll put that in quotes, presented to you. That's all you know. You learn how to get from here to there. You might not even get to the same conclusion that your teacher did, and it could still be good because you might actually improve on what that person taught you.
Let me see if I can make a point back to chapter 1 of 1 Corinthians, verse 18. There is a particular participle that I think that makes a lot of sense to a lot of people. It's a present tense participle, middle or passive. When we say something is middle or passive, there's a lot to suggest in that vein, but I will get into that in another teaching. But this participle has to be parsed. That is, the morphological information is not just verb, but it's very much a dative masculine plural. And that's why it's a verbal, not a verb. That's what a participle is, especially in Greek. A Greek participle can function in so many different kinds of parts of speech, that is, in transport when we take it into English. But here's my point. So menois is the term here, and the possibility of it meaning something that actually comes to the people. That is, it's if I said I hit the ball, that would be an active voice. context. If I said I was hit by the ball, that means that the subject isn't the doer, but the recipient of the action. The same thing could be true here, that salvation is not salvation at all, but this is a sense of security that's just coming to people like Paul. Now, in this context, he says, who mean, and then he goes on to say, dunamis theou estin. Now, he uses the acquative estin, but he uses the term dunamis theou. Now, let's focus in on dunamis. So many people would say, oh, wow, and I've heard this stated in theological circles more than not, dunamis, oh, it's dynamite. Well, yeah, later on when dynamite was actually created, the Greeks certainly did use this term for the word dynamite, but they didn't have dynamite back in the days of Paul. And so it's not possible that Paul meant dynamite. And this is how crazy people get in theology, because they want to see this being the power of God. I would even challenge that this notion of power of God is not even there. And here's why.
Right.
If you'll turn in your Bible to 1 Corinthians chapter 14, you're going to see something in verse 11. I'm going to read verse 11 from the NIV. If then I do not grasp the meaning of what someone is saying. Look at this in verse 11. If I read this from the King James Bible, therefore if I know not the meaning of the voice, okay? If I don't grasp the meaning. Now listen to this carefully in Greek. It's inflected differently because this is an inflected language. It says, tain dunamin. In other words, dunamis is just different case, okay? Dunamin, okay? This is the word dunamis, okay? Why is the word dunamin translated? It's not translated as power, but it's translated as grasp. Grasping what? The meaning of the sound. That's how translators work. Is Paul saying that this is the power of God, or this is the manner in which people were grasping God? And so that's my point. My point is, I don't think it has anything to do with power in chapter 1, verse 18. I think it has to do with grasping at straws, if you will, because they were feeling this sense. This was coming to them. This was not something that they were going to. They were feeling secure with one thing. And I think that Paul's juxtaposition style of writing, he would compare this with that, back and forth. I think he was trying to tease something out. And so I think he's very much anti the crucifixion, the doctrine of the cross and all of that. But I think that he goes about telling this story with a rhythm that goes, look at this and that, and you go back and forth. But the English text is poorly put together, that is, in transport. And so a lot of people get confused with this, and I don't think that any serious scholarship would back up what we have in our English reads in any of this. And I know that it doesn't have lexical support any longer, and I'm very, very thankful. And so this is what I'm saying. When it comes to theology, the study, let's say, and research concerning the question of God, not just the question of God, but all of the different stories that people have written in the name of theos or whatever. The question is, are we disciplined enough to say, okay, these are the thoughts of a person who is struggling with X, Y, and Z. Theologians go there. They don't attempt to write the gospel. They're not trying to market the gospel. They're simply trying to make sense of what this person might say. Examine people on so many different levels. And so I want to know your thoughts about that, Bob, because I'm troubled because, looking at Greek for so many years, I mean, it's been a lifetime with me, and I'm not convinced that I know what Paul is actually, what his intent was, but I feel like I can grasp a little bit more these days simply because there is a lot of mileage underneath my feet. And I see it differently, and I think that others are as well. And so, why are people not taking a disciplined approach when it comes to theology? Why are people just throwing anything that they want to at it? And I'm
Well, I
talking
mean,
about theists and atheists alike.
right. Well, who wants to take a disciplined approach when I find that I need to belong to the right side? I think that we as human beings, for reasons that are not entirely clear to us, we feel that there's this need that somehow when I'm thinking, that I'm thinking correctly. It's not just that I would like to. It's like I feel like, oh my God, I have to. I must. And as if I'm like, what's going to happen if you have a wrong thought or an
Right.
inaccurate thought? What's going to happen? You know, uh, in most cases, nothing. You know, uh, and as a result, I think that we don't realize we're choking our free ability to think out of this artificial pressure to be right. And oh my God, how embarrassing for me to pretend to be a person who's intelligent and actually have an idea that turns out to be absolutely incorrect. I mean, oh my God, well, how embarrassing. Well, really, you know, uh, who do you think you are? I mean, what abilities do you think you really possess? What is it about this that makes you feel like it has to be this way? So I think we put ourselves under this artificial pressure that that then seduces us into that kind of craziness, and so we create this problem by imagining that there's some need we have to actually do this.
I
and,
think
and there
that
isn't.
D.B. Cisco is making a brilliant point. He said, "The trout I caught grows an inch per telling." I love that. But, but I think that it does grow by each telling simply because I think when we're talking about God, it's like we've got to talk about essence. We have to talk about existence. We have to talk about being. When do you hear conversations about God that have nothing to do with essence, being, or existence? Why can't we look at the question, is there a God, without talking about existence, being, essence? Why do we have to wrap it up within a framework that we understand? Why can't we admit that there is a possibility that God is well outside of that? Thoughts, Bob?
Well, we haven't established the fact that we even have a way of talking about this that makes sense. But wouldn't we like there to be? And not only that, but the question of is there a God has absolutely nothing to do with the question, am I in trouble? Is there a hell? Or all those other things that we've so much
Right.
attached to the religious package. So when many times people are feel this need to prove there's a God or prove that there isn't, it's really because they're assuming a huge package deal here that isn't necessarily the case, you know.
Okay, let's shift the subject a bit because I want to get out of here. I don't want to go for a long, long time. We were late tonight, but I want to talk about unconditional love and acceptance and becoming allies with people. Daryl, start first. Share your thoughts on unconditional love and acceptance that's happening, that is, within the framework of you being dad and grandpa.
Good timing. I just spent some time with my oldest son, which is 20 years older than the youngest. And I had the youngest there at the same time, which was kind of unique. But I was putting it to him like this. If you look at the God that is presented in most cases as being God, it's one who accepts some, rejects others. He created all, but some he's good with, some he's not. And I said, let's compare that to a parent, myself, for example. Let's just say I've got a son that does everything the way I think he should. I mean, he pleases me in every way. And in my way of thinking, he's near perfect. I mean, he's the perfect son. And it's obvious that I love this son. I approve of him. Uh, everything's wonderful. But let's say I've got another son, and let me qualify this. I'm not really talking about the situation that I have with my sons. So don't go looking for my bad son. So let's just say there's one who's lazy, he's a bum, he's good for nothing, does everything wrong in my sight. And therefore, I totally reject him. I say, you're not my son. I don't want anything to do with you. As a matter of fact, I'm going to torture you. I'm going to punish you. Now, when I think of unconditional love, I think of loving these two sons the same. It doesn't have anything to do with my care, my affection, my approach toward my sons. And so when people look at me, now this is, a lot of my opinion here, but if they see someone who loves unconditionally, one who is perfect in my sight, and reject another who doesn't conform to my way of thinking, is totally depraved in my sight, then what does that say? On the other hand, if someone looks at me and they see the same love, caring, reaching out, whatever the case might call for, to each of these sons the same, what does that say? And to me, it says, now we're talking about something unconditional. We're talking about something that goes beyond what we as individuals expect or require in order for our love to be extended towards someone.
Right. Diana, your thoughts?
Well, excuse me, please. I'm going to come at it from the other side of the Earl's coin, and think of the unconditional love. What if there is a daughter who does everything that the parents want, and they give her the total love and everything else, but there's another daughter, and I have no idea who I'd be talking about, who is just totally different, who just has to be different, who does things in a different way, looks at things at a different angle, and she is a horrible person. But yet, what if she manages to see things differently such that she comes to a better idea of the world around her than that perfect daughter?
Right.
I mean, shouldn't she get some modicum of love and affection for trying the different way, even if she doesn't come to that better conclusion? At least she's trying something new. And shouldn't she be loved as well? And maybe that's what unconditional love is all about.
To a certain degree, you're making my point.
Yeah.
Because it's not just a thing of, because I mean, at a person's best, and I'll just use myself as an example, as good as I can get, I'm not going to fit any model of perfection. I never will. And so for me to gauge my children by my way of thinking, by my estimation, by my standard, is to actually cut myself off from the possibilities of what you just stated. Because if I'm willing to embrace and not push away, not shove away, that doesn't mean I can't be vocal, that we can't sit down and, like we encourage here in NCG, let's have a conversation. Let's talk about these things.
Right.
And maybe in the process, I'm going to see some things that I wouldn't otherwise see. I'm going to learn from my own child, who I think is so out of sorts and so wrong and so whatever, because I'm willing to not reject and not turn away from then I open myself up to learn and to grow and to love in a way that I didn't even think I could possibly.
Yeah, and I mean, isn't that daughter kind of right in thinking that she is? I hate to use the word entitled because it's misused so badly, but entitled to some affection for that because of the point you just made. Um, she may come up with something absolutely earth-shattering and new and novel and so much better. Even if she doesn't, at least she's trying.
Absolutely.
Bob, what are your thoughts on unconditional love and acceptance?
Well, I'm actually going to take a slightly different approach to this. I think that unconditional love is useless. But I think that what we think of as unconditional love is just a way of talking about it. I don't think that our love is really unconditional. If I were to truly love someone unconditionally, that would mean that I love them because I just have this affection towards them. Are they worthless and useless? Yeah, but I love them anyway because there's just no conditions on it. But I think that what really helps people is when you love them and you love them because there's a really good reason to love them, and that there's a tremendous warrant and justification for loving them, and that warrant and justification is this: they're a human being. This isn't tied to performance. Why should the acceptability and even the warranted loveliness of another human being be tied to whether or not they please my needs, meet my expectations? What do my expectations have to do with the real value and loveliness of being human? I mean, if if I think if I think your performance is awesome, what happens when I die to your performance and your value as a human being? Does that change? Does my existence determine your? So I think that there's a sense here in which the condition for love is that you be human, and and that we recognize that your experience, the qualia of your life, is a very important thing, and the way that you've turned out may not be good or bad. It may not be easy, or it might have some problems, and et cetera, of course. And that's not to say that these aren't issues we can't deal with, but they have absolutely nothing to do with why it is, as an existence, you really are lovely. And in my own counseling, when a minister, and in other times when I've been involved in a relationship with somebody where I'm trying to help them come to grips with their ability to like themselves, I try to make a big point out of the fact that, I really like you. And that has absolutely nothing to do with my being a nice person. I like you because you are likable. I like you because what you are as a human being represents a value that I am simply at a point in my life where I am aware of just how wonderful this is, and how true this is, apart from whether or not it's working for me or not. And as a result, I want the people that I would love to feel like this is something very intrinsic within themselves, very real, very solid, very unchangeable, and decouple it from their performance or their intelligence or what they can accomplish or the good that they do. So to me, I think that I think it would give people a better opportunity to know the value of being loved when it's not just something that we do for them because we're nice. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I'm trying to communicate an idea that what is
You
lovely
are.
about you is something I am only able to be aware of. It has nothing to do with how I feel.
One of the things that resonates with me a great deal, if Jesus would have said it, I think that he would have improved his message. But Thomas Merton said this. He said, "The beginning of love is to let those we love be perfectly themselves, and not to twist them to fit our own image. Otherwise, we love only the reflection of ourselves we find in them. Let me read that again. I mean, that's powerful. The beginning of love is to let those we love be perfectly themselves and not to twist them to fit our own image. Otherwise, we love only the reflection of ourselves we find in them. And so if you're in love and you're trying to get people to, in a sense, mimic what you reflect, you need to rethink that in light of what Thomas suggested. And so I just wanted to talk about love just for a moment. Bob, I do want you to make a comment because this is one of my favorite topics, and we're going to have a show on this pretty soon, hopefully. And so I'm going to ask Jack if he would just zoom into my cell phone, and I'll show you the image. Okay, talk to me, Bob. Pull it in, Jack.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, duck or rabbit?
Yes. That's a duck or a rabbit.
Okay, can you see the rabbit and the duck at the same
definitely, yeah.
time?
I cannot see it at the same time. Isn't that interesting?
Difficult.
I even though I can see that the lines are there at the same time, I either see it as a duck or I see it as a rabbit, and sometimes it oscillates, very quickly. But it's either a duck or a rabbit. And by the way, don't you think that's an awesome drawing?
Oh, yeah. But I want you to dig into that and drill down a bit on that. I think that we've had conversations much on this because I think there's a lot to add. Give me about 5 minutes worth on duck and rabbit.
Well, it's been a while since I've talked about that, so let me see if I can resurrect my thoughts. Well, first of all, part of the reason why I made that drawing, and I made that drawing a long time ago, is that I believe that reality is something none of us can actually see because reality is way too big, way too complex, filled with too many variables. And as a result, we really can't see reality. So what do? Well, we come up with a dumbed down version of reality that involves various features that we might point out. And one of the things that's interesting about an optical illusion is the way that an optical illusion works is that an optical illusion only includes enough information for us to believe that we see within it something that is actually more complete than what we really see. But an optical illusion is something where the sparse information present can actually work for more than one possibility simultaneously. And I would want to argue that the human brain has to reduce reality as we experience it by so much that it turns into a sparse, scarce picture that could have actually more than one explanation. But the explanation you tend to give to it is the one that you see in it, not the other one. Unless you've learned to be so multi-axial that you can begin to see, oh yeah, those are the lines for that other possibility. And once you are able to see that, I mean, if you've never seen a rabbit, that couldn't possibly look like a rabbit to you. If all you've ever seen are ducks, that's going to just look like a duck to you. If all you've ever seen are rabbits, it's going to look like a rabbit to you. But if you've seen ducks and rabbits, that picture can become a problem for you. And so if you're multi-axial, you'll actually begin to see reality as your perspective of reality is really a sparse representation. And as that sparse representation, you begin to realize, oh, wow, there's far more than just the one explanation that I have resonated with, that this sparse representation could actually be a representation of. And of course, let me go back to one of the first things that I said. I believe that we as human beings possess a certain limitation that forces us to always understand a reduction of reality rather than reality itself. We're not in touch with reality. We only are in touch with it through our senses, right. And even there, only in the way that our senses have learned to organize that reality into categorical objects which we're able to grasp, make sense of, and manage in our mind. And that's how we will see reality. And the more multi-axial we are, the more possibilities we will realize exist within that scarce stimulus.
Okay, skeptical Jed said, it looks like a horse to me.
Well, then he's amazing because maybe it's there. I
That's
thought it was a
good.
unicorn myself, but
Okay. Okay, we are out of time, but I'm going to come back and give everyone a chance to share their final thoughts. But I wanted to say this. You know, we live in a day in which we have better technology. We really don't have any excuses for being so ignorant. And I'm trying to encourage people to do things like this. I'm reading this from a pick, okay? This is not what I authored. This is what some people have just thought to be good for other people. Google it. Don't be afraid to Google it. Check Snopes.com. Look in an encyclopedia. Ask a professor in that field. Just do some research first before sharing a post. Pictures and words together do not make them true. Stop sharing posts before checking its accuracy. In other words, stop contributing to the ignorance. I think that people need to do more than just Google or look at an encyclopedia. I think that if people are interested in having a discussion concerning the Bible, I would think that they would need to learn the languages. They would need to learn something about hermeneutics. I think they would need to spend years, that is, researching the methods and the practices that will produce an outcome that's a bit measured as opposed to guesswork. And so if you're in the great debate and you haven't taken the time to do some of those things, don't debate the Bible. Don't feel as if your remarks about the Bible are going anywhere, because I think you're just throwing bullshit up into the air. And so with that said, I think that...
Could I add just
one
last
go for it.
item? There are a lot of controversies in this world. And I would want to argue that not with all of them, but probably with most of them, you do not understand that controversy until you understand it so thoroughly, you're in a conundrum.
Right. Say that again, Bob, a little bit louder, because that's a lot.
Okay, one more time.
Wisdom.
There are a lot of controversies in this world, and here's something that is true of most of them, not necessarily all of them. That if you were to truly understand that controversy thoroughly, you would
Right.
find yourself in a conundrum.
That's good. That's really good. Daryl, final comments, and I've got the orange pen ready.
Well, that statement that Bob just made really plays into what I wanted to be my final statement. You know, I don't mind being known as the guy who really likes to emphasize the idea of love. I mean, you know, I'll be that guy all day long, because, you know, that's huge to me. And when I think of it as being huge, not just in the sense that the importance of it, but the category itself, try to define the thing and get an accurate definition of exactly what love is. Try to demonstrate how it's shown in each and every case that it's that you can, you know, see this thing that we've defined here. I think you would spend a lifetime in a conundrum, as Bob says. But it's kind of like so many other things. Is it worth pursuing? I think would be the real question. Is it worth, you know, investing our effort, our time into trying to determine exactly what it is and how it should work in our human relationships? And I like the way Bob put that, you know, because as long as, and of course it goes beyond that, you know, it goes into nature, it goes into, you know, the way we show it to our surroundings. But you know, it's like I said, it's pretty hard to nail down, but it's something that's as real as anything else that we have, and um, I would categorize it as, of course, the best thing. But I don't know. That's my thought.
Excellent. Diane, I'm going to ask you to really up your game here because you're exceptional, but I think that you can be even above that. So what you put on the table at the end of this show needs to count. Put out the gold, put out the platinum here, knock a grand slam, go for it.
Well, I'll try to swing for the fence. It sounds like we've got three minds that are thinking alike here at the end of this show. The thing that I was thinking is that, I mean, in dealing with questions like the one we're dealing with today, what I'd like to see from more people, myself included, and especially, is not to look at it the way we've been looking at it, but rather, what if it's wrong? What if I'm wrong? What then? What can I get out of this that could still be useful if my ideas were not quite the right ideas to come from? Now, I know that that's not very useful in backing up a preconception, or that's not very useful in a warm feeling of immediate salvation. But hopefully it is a path to learning.
Right.
And I'm all about learning, and I hope there are other people who are.
That's very good. Now, tonight, I would like to encourage you to go to ncgstudios.tv. Not .com, but ncgstudios.tv. If you're interested in becoming a part of NCG and supporting NCG, we would love that, simply because we want to build meaningful community. We want to build a modality that's, rising above what we see to the left and the right. In doing so, I think that we can make a difference that is in our present and in our future. And I so want to do something extremely good, exceptional for our children and grandchildren. Now, if that's your heart, if that's your desire, please help us make us, let's do this together, in other words. And so thank you for your time, and we love you so, so much, and thanks for being here. Good night.
Take care, all.